Hello, I'm David Lockington, Music Director of your Pasadena Symphony, and I want to welcome you to the third program of our Pasadena Presents Spring Season. Toward the end of the 19th century, the styles of French and German music diverged dramatically. Even after his death in 1883, Wagner's influence haunted Europe. His music dramas had captured the spirit of an age with their mystical and mythological roots and their psychological exploration. But a few gentle French voices soon started to rebel against the Schopenhauer-based philosophy of the world as will and the long-windedness. Drips of subtle protest by the likes of Satie became crashing waves of independence in the hands of Debussy and Ravel. So this program brings these trends into sharp relief in the first half through Wagner's most harmonically far-reaching work, Tristan and Isolde, to Debussy's Antique Dances and Ravel's Septet Fantasy. The second half is devoted to another wild spirit, Prokofiev, and his third piano concerto. I want to introduce you to the musicians who will be performing for you today. They are Valentina Lisitsa, accompanied by Xinyi Huang, Alison Bjorkedal, harp, Joel Pargman, Carrie Kennedy, playing violins, violists Aaron Altman and Carrie Holtzman-Little, and cellists Dane Little and Ryan Sweeney. We also have two wind players, flute Heather Clark and clarinet Phil O'Connor. The prelude to the opera Tristan and Isolde represents the awakening of the protagonists to each other after they drink not poison as agreed upon, but a love potion. The obsessiveness of the passion which it engenders can only be fulfilled in death, which is where naturally the story is headed. Silences punctuate the encroaching recognition. And the so-called Tristan chord, with its resultant non-resolution, it ends on a dominant seventh chord, suggesting we're going somewhere else. This sets off a musical revolution which still reverberates 160 years later. Desire which can never fully be satisfied often finds its way back to being expressed by this chord and its consequence. Let's hear it again. We're going to play an arrangement for string sextet, two violins, two violas, and two cellos, a far cry from the vast orchestra that Wagner wrote for. But Wagner's music, as colorful and revolutionary as it is, can be rescored and adapted because the tension and release of the harmonies is what drives it, rather like Bach, which is very resilient to arrangements for the same reason. Wagner interrupted the writing of the Ring Cycle while he was in exile, which was because of his involvement in the 1848 revolution in Dresden during the 1850s. For a time, he was living with a wealthy patron, Otto Wesendonck, and his wife in Zurich. It was Mathilde Wesendonck who became Wagner's muse, all the more powerfully since their infatuation with each other seems to have been unconsummated. Feeling like an outsider, Wagner was reading Schopenhauer and searching for nirvana. Interestingly, Hans von Bülow, Wagner's most important interpreter, had recently written a fantasy called Nirvana, in which he explored unresolved dissonance through what we now call the Tristan chord. Wagner had cautioned him against extreme use of this device, but then completely co-opted it for his own Tristan. More than incidentally, Wagner also co-opted von Bülow's wife, Cosima, in 1863, making him a considerable source of ridicule in the music world. In fact, Tristan was premiered with Bülow conducting while his wife and Wagner were continuing their affair. And another aside, it was von Bülow who premiered Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto in Boston in 1875. Tristan required almost 100 rehearsals to put on. Around number 70, Wagner realized that the principals had been miscast, and so hired a husband and wife team, Ludwig and Malvina Schnorr von Karlsfeld, who premiered it in Munich, funded by King Ludwig of Bavaria, in 1865. Ludwig, the Tristan, died at the age of 29 after 4 performances. The music is all about holding our breathless passion for as long as possible, as indicated by the ambiguous opening. It rises and falls and reaches such climaxes, sometimes joyful, sometimes tragic. The arrangement we're playing by Sebastian Gürtler has a concert ending, which actually consists of music from the Liebestod, or Love Death, which ends the opera. And the final resolution is transcendent. About 40 years later, we find Debussy and Ravel being used by competing harp companies to further their businesses. The separation from the Wagnerian cult had started a long time before, actually about 20 years. The quiet revolution of Debussy's L'après-midi d'un faune of 1894 was a continuation of experimental music by Satie in the late 1880s when he wrote his Gymnopédie. The most Wagnerian Debussy gets is in the brief and understated middle section. In many ways, it's more like Tchaikovsky with the pulsing accompaniment, rather like the big love melody in Romeo and Juliet. Perhaps this comparison is not so far-fetched, because Debussy, aged 18, tutored Tchaikovsky's patroness children during the summer. Debussy admired Wagner and even went to Bayreuth twice in 1888 and 1889, but aesthetically quickly moved away. He was more influenced by the International Exposition that took place in Paris in 1889, for which the Eiffel Tower was built, where vast amounts of art and music were presented from Asia. The pentatonic scale, the black keys on the piano, and the whole tone scale, provided harmonically non-functional building blocks that were distinctly non-Wagnerian. Here's an example of how Debussy uses the whole tone scale in the dances. The music floats diaphanously. Just before the danse sacré et profane, more ethereal and corporeal or earthy than to do with sacredness and profanity, Debussy had had a huge success with his opera Pelléas and Mélisande in 1902. Its text is symbolist, actually influenced by Wagner's libretto of Tristan, and is the opposite of Tristan. Everything is nuance and insinuation. The harp piece you're going to hear is often limpid and transparent in a similar way, perhaps evoking a bygone era. Here's the opening. The strings set an almost monastic tone, and then our winsome heroine appears. The second dance evokes a static kind of waltz, definitely a cousin of Satie's Gymnopédie. The dances were premiered by chromatic harpist Lucille Wurmser de Cour. The musical language of the piece was specially designed for the Pleyel harp, which was essentially two banks of intersecting strings functioning as the black and white keys of the piano. Now here is Alison Bjorkedal, who's going to be soloing with us, describing the differences between that harp and the double action harp which Earhart asked Ravel to write his piece for, and which actually won the Battle of the Harps.
To understand about the harps used in these two pieces, it helps to know a little bit of music theory. Let's take a look. Out of all the sounds in the planet, classical music chooses to narrow it down to about 12 distinct notes. We can think about this most easily by visualizing a piano keyboard. There's a set of white notes and black keys. And in that pattern of white notes and black keys, the white notes repeat after 7 pitches, and the black notes repeat after 5. So that's 12 unique pitches overall on a piano keyboard, and those are the pitches of classical music. Now the harp is a little bit different. Taking a look at my strings here, they're actually color-coded to help me find my way around. Let's start on this red string, which is my C string. From C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have 7 strings before I start to repeat again. So the harp only has 7 unique pitches on its strings before it starts to repeat. So as composers started to use more of the 12 pitches in their music, a language we call in music chromaticism, harpists were having a hard time keeping up, and that's where harp instrument makers stepped in. First, let's explore the harp for the Debussy. Debussy was commissioned by the Pleyel Company of Paris to start to write his piece for a chromatic harp. Chromatic harps are sometimes known as cross-strung harps, which is a very apt name because it's basically two sets of strings crossed in the center. One set of string has the 7 white notes of the piano, and the second set of strings has the 5 black notes of the piano, and they cross so that the harpist can select from the top or bottom set of strings for all of the 12 pitches that she or he might want to play. The Erard Company of France heard about the Debussy commission for the chromatic harp and quickly sought after Ravel to make a commission for their harp, the double action pedal harp. The pedal harp was an invention made possible by the Industrial Revolution because it is really almost half machine, more than instrument. In the neck mechanism here, there's over 1,000 moving parts, and they go down through the column into the base where there's a set of 7 pedals controlled by the feet. Each pedal has 3 positions. One position allows all of the mechanism to be open so that the string is the longest or lowest pitch available. The second position twists the disc so that the string is now pinched and is slightly shorter, and that creates a new pitch. And the third position closes both discs so that the string is the shortest it can possibly be and is the highest pitch. This means every string on a double action pedal harp has the ability to be 3 pitches on a piano. When we think of the harp, many people think of this distinct sound. That's called a glissando, and we do it by gliding our fingers across the string. But one of the things that makes that special harpy sound is that we can set the pedals so that there are very distinct pitches. If you think about it, there's 7 pedals, each with 3 unique positions. That allows for a lot of different really interesting glissandi. The chromatic harp, however, only had 2 glissandos possible. You could choose one set of strings and get the 7 white notes of the piano, or you could choose the other set of strings and get the 5 black notes of the piano. So one way in which Ravel really takes advantage of being the responder to the original commission by Debussy is you'll notice he writes a lot of really unique glissandos for the harp that really showcase the pedal harp. Technically, the pedal harp won this battle, but I think the real winners here are audiences and harpists throughout the ages who have enjoyed these 2 pieces of repertoire by early 20th century masters.
Being about 13 years older, Debussy had mentored Ravel, but in the public mind, there arose a question about who influenced who, and the discussions sometimes became so fierce that people almost came to blows. The composers actually admired each other's works, but Debussy was offended when Ravel didn't adopt some of his suggestions, and also when Ravel said he could improve on La Mer if he reorchestrated it, and Debussy was incensed. When Debussy left his wife for his mistress, just before the composition of the dances, Ravel sent money to his ex. Her suffering was still so crippling that she attempted suicide. The shot was not fatal, but Debussy's reputation in the public eye plunged as a result. Soon after the 2 pieces were premiered, within a year of each other, the composer's strained relationship ended. Ravel himself didn't quite understand the rift, but noted, "It's probably better for us, after all, to be on frigid terms for illogical reasons." While Debussy's dances have a restrained quality, Ravel's introduction and allegro is more like a fantasy concerto. It's a 1-movement piece with a very slow introduction and then alternating fast, up-tempo, waltz-like sections with harp interludes, also featuring an extensive cadenza. The quartet is beautifully enhanced by the clarinet and the flute. The opening lays out the two principal ideas, an harmonically ambiguous pendulum-like motion in the clarinet and flute, followed by a floating stepwise, restrained yearning melody in the strings, decorated by a classic harp peacock feather flourish. Later, he combines the two. There's one moment of great passion, which is practically Wagnerian, as the harp burst in despairingly on the fainting ensemble. Micheline Kahn was the harpist who premiered this piece, which Ravel wrote in a matter of hours, and interestingly, never included in his official catalogue of works. Ravel conducted the first recording of the piece in 1923, and it's interesting to compare his performance with the markings in the score. Both the Debussy and the Ravel end with bravura and an uplifted tone, but I particularly like the nostalgic dance towards the end of the Ravel. The Russian composers of the late 19th century rebelled against German musical and aesthetic influences earlier than the French. They were driven by nationalism, leading them to folk themes, and later by the aristocracy's deep connection to French culture. It was Diaghilev's bold Parisian productions that led to the revolutionary innovations of Stravinsky, who was born in 1882, coalescing into the ballet of 1913, The Rite of Spring. So, 130 years ago, on April the 27th, 1891, so 9 years Stravinsky's junior, Prokofiev was born in Ukraine, and 100 years ago, Prokofiev had his two first major international successes, one in Paris in May and one in Chicago in December. His first 30 years revealed an extraordinarily adventurous spirit. His first composition at age 5 was in F major, without the single B flat of the key signature, making the scale sound like this. La 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 la. He was already off to the exotic and dissonant races. His early grounding was traditional, but by the age of 11, he was already prone to shocking, and he was clearly set to rival the older Stravinsky's revolutionary style. Prokofiev was, however, just as able to coax and be charmingly direct harmonically, as he demonstrated in his tonal Classical Symphony No. 1, written while he was still a student. This broad stylistic palette set him up perfectly for the drama of his 7 operas that he wrote, the first being The Love of Three Oranges, which is what was premiered in Chicago in 1921. The Tale of the Buffoon Who Outwits 7 Other Buffoons was the ballet that Diaghilev presented in Paris also in 1921, which Stravinsky praised as the single piece of modern music I could listen to with pleasure. Ravel also called it a work of genius. Stravinsky and Prokofiev were, however, not always on good terms. The year after the ballet and the opera, they apparently nearly came to blows and had to be separated over Stravinsky's suggestion that Prokofiev shouldn't waste his time writing operas, and his own subsequent sensitivity to Prokofiev's criticisms. At age 30, 1921 was also the year of his third piano concerto, which he finished and premiered 2 weeks before his opera in Chicago on December the 16th with Frederick Stock and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. The concerto had its beginnings 11 years before, when he was writing 3 concertos simultaneously, and then 8 years prior with a set of variations destined for the second movement, another false start in 1918-19, but then fulfillment in this auspicious year of 1921. The first half of that year was spent in Brittany, France, with other expats, one of whom was his future first wife. He played a lot of chess. He was a great chess player and enjoyed the company of the poet Constantine Balmont, to whom the concerto is dedicated. As demanding as the concerto is, it's not gratuitously virtuosic. The second concerto was designed to dazzle on every level, but the third is not a show-off concerto. After an innocent orchestral introduction, the strings rush to raise the curtain and the piano rushes on stage with a carefree and fresh breeziness. The second theme has that characteristically quirky, march-like quality that Prokofiev does so well. And it's the constantly shifting harmonies that give it such a character. Contrast is everything, and the beauty of the piano version of the folk-like introduction is stunning. The second movement theme for his variations has an almost fatalistic, Puccini-like air, which means that it's packed full of possibilities. Now, do you think Gershwin knew this? it seems that irony was always at the ready in Prokofiev's back pocket. And there's also a level of grotesquerie. The last movement begins with a kind of mutant waltz, which delights in its almost mechanistic, lopsided insistence. Prokofiev's lyrical romanticism soon comes to the fore, both insinuating through chromaticism and searching for hope through reaching intervals. After a few more questioning diversions, Prokofiev reprises this theme triumphantly. The uncouth waltz provides the material to bring the concerto to a dazzlingly bright ending. These were heady times, but sadly not sustainable. Prokofiev lived mostly in Europe the next 10 years, but then with the Depression, he started to make a transition back to the Soviet Union, accepting more and more commissions. So in 1936, after 18 years away, with permission, Prokofiev returned to the Soviet Union to enjoy mostly great supported productivity as a composer. Peter and the Wolf was one of the first pieces Prokofiev wrote on his return, reflecting the positivity he found as a devotee of Christian Science, which he discovered during his time in the West. He said it helped him with his anger and depression. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson coincidentally died on the same day, July the 4th, 1826. And interestingly, Prokofiev died the same day as Stalin, on March the 5th, 1953. And his coffin had to be carried through the back streets against the throngs of people, because the hearse wouldn't get through them, who were amassing to mourn the state leader. Thus, only 30 people attended Prokofiev's funeral, while hundreds of people died in the crush to honor the deceased dictator. I hope you enjoy this rich program of revolution and innovation.